grief and trauma, these are two things that most of us cannot avoid. So, but how are we dealing with them when they come up? Are we able to move through them in a way that makes it easier for us, makes it maybe faster for us? And I'm excited to bring to you one of our authors in our book, the Evolution of Leadership in STEM, Women Catalyzing Change. We're going to be talking about grief and trauma, how to move through it, how to live a better life, and that there is beautifulness, wonderfulness on the other side of trauma. Please stick around if you are experiencing this right now, or if you know somebody who is experiencing grief or trauma right now, please direct them to this video. They're definitely going to want to take advantage of this. We'll be right back. Hi, my name is Lynda Sunshine West. I'm the founder and CEO at Action Takers Publishing. One of the things I love doing is to showcase our authors, to bring their message to the world so we can make a greater impact on the planet. And one of those authors that we have with us today is Claire Skillen. She's author in this book, Evolution of Leadership in STEM. And you can get a copy of the book by going to actiontakerspublishing.com/STEM, STEM. And while you're over there, there are free gifts from our authors. Go cash in on those as well. Claire, I'm excited to talk about this topic because, grief and trauma, these are two things that we all experience at one time in our life or another. And the question is, how do we make our way through it? I know that I spent many years in traumatic situations that I kept carrying around with me for decades. Like something happened to me in an instant or in a quick moment or a short period of time. And then 30, 40 years later, I still was experiencing that trauma because I held on to it and realizing now how damaging that was for my whole life, And so no blame, no shame, no nothing like that. But, here I am to say that I made it through it. And it would have been nice to have had more help because maybe I didn't know I needed help. Honestly, I thought I was fine. And so I'd love to hear how you got into this type of work of helping people through, situations, working with trauma and grief and what you do to help them. So you've got the floor, girl.
Thank you, Lynda, and thanks for sharing a little bit about your own experience with it as well. I'm sure that many can relate to that too. And as for me, I've always felt like I was a healer. I've had many different adventures and solved many different problems over the course of my career and with many different hats on my head. And yet completing my master's in counseling psychology, which is what's in progress at the moment, has always felt like home. And so I'm grateful to have my own kind of homecoming and becoming a healer. And one of the neat bridges between STEM and counseling psychology, I find, and there's more than one, believe me, is the concept of thinking in systems and looking at root causes. And I've always felt that trauma is really at the root cause of a lot of challenges that people face. And I feel that in a way, if I'm able to co-pilot with people, that's what I like to call it, because really we're co-pilots in healing. You as the person and the individual have an innate wisdom. And as a counselor, I'm there to help you unlock it, right? And so like a co-pilot, things might start off a little bumpy. And I may drive for a little bit, but the goal is to get you comfortable enough flying your own plane. And maybe I'm down on the ground doing air traffic control for you for a little bit. So yeah, exactly. You got it. So with trauma, I think there's such an opportunity to have an impact in someone's life. And trauma, as you mentioned, can often get in the way of people living the life that they want. or moving forward with things. It can keep people stuck. It can cause pain. People cope with it in ways that maybe aren't ways that they feel are healthy or healthy for others as well, because they didn't have that support to guide them through the process. So there's a real opportunity to have a meaningful impact in someone's life, which is really quite amazing and a privilege, obviously, as a mental health professional. So the thing with trauma is it shows up in so many different ways. And sometimes we can go through something, big or small, and yet it can still have an impact. And we don't even know, as you pointed out, you might not have even been aware that it had that kind of impact on you. And so in the mind, everything feels fine, like nothing's going on, but you might all of a sudden wonder why, or maybe over time you wonder why. It's like, why do I constantly have pain in my lower back? Or, why does my elbow always hurt? This never used to be an issue. And, I haven't been playing tennis for a while, for example. And so trauma has a way of showing up in a number of different places. Sometimes it can be in how we breathe and how we move, maybe our digestion and things. So a lot of times I find the focus on trauma is around what we think about. And yes, that's definitely important, but it also shows up in the body.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because several of the different things came to mind as you were talking there. One thing is, like, there's a program I'm watching right now, and there's a young girl in it. She's about 9 years old, and she lashes out. She lives in a very traumatic situation, and her lashing out could be a result of the trauma that she's growing up in. And there's so many different ways for us to see trauma, but us ourselves, like, she's like, I'm okay. There's nothing wrong, because she doesn't see it. She's living it. And so I'm curious about, like, how do we know, like, how do we ourselves know if we experience trauma? Because trauma it's not always like a car accident, because you experience trauma.
That's right.
Like, that's like obvious. Okay. But then you grew up in a home where, like, for me, for example, it was a very volatile, abusive, alcoholic home. And while I'm living in it, I don't know, because this is all I know. This is life. And so later in life, I'm like, oh, that was a traumatic situation. Now I can do something about it, recover from it, or whatever terminology. But how do we know that what is a good test, I guess, a good test or measure for us to say there was a traumatic situation that maybe I need to look at that?
Well, one thing I remember doing myself, that also I've had people, share stories with me. And as per your point, if it's normal for you, you don't recognize that it's not. And so that is such a key piece. I've heard the expression, and forgive me, I don't remember where this comes from. So credit to another lovely soul for this piece.
Someone.
Yeah. Is when you explain your story to someone that hasn't been through it, or explain your story to someone that has had, by the world standards, or like society standards, a relatively stable experience growing up, you start to learn the difference between what's normal and what wasn't. So that's one that really stuck with me, because I know a few friends that have been in abusive relationships, and maybe it wasn't physical abuse, but more emotional abuse. And when they started to share their story with myself and another friend, they looked at our facial expressions and of concern and shock, and we started to unpack that afterwards. And sometimes it takes an external point of view to help you realize that what you went through wasn't something that everybody went through, right?
Yeah, I love that. That's a great way, because you use your barometer, I guess, so to speak, would be what a normal life would be. And because you don't know that until you start talking to people. I know, like, one of the things when I say or tell people that when I was 5 years old, I ran away and I was gone for an entire week. Oftentimes I get the what,
Yeah,
and
I
for
just
me it
did
was
that.
right. For me, it was just part of my life. It was part of my
Yeah,
life, and I never knew that it was a big deal. I just didn't
yeah,
know. And so it is interesting because like I said, because we're living in our own little lives. And that
yeah,
brings up another question, because I hear these phrases all the time. And personally, this drives me nuts. I can't stand it. Is that I hear the little T and the big T of trauma. And so to me, I'm sure the reason why I can't stand this in a minute after Claire speaks. Teaser. So the big T trauma, the little T trauma. What do you think about that?
I think that's a concept that's in the process of being debunked, to be honest, because
Good.
yeah, and I agree with that too. It's not a concept I subscribe to. I think trauma takes many different shapes, and it's not as simple as putting it into two different buckets. It's just no. I think there's various, because something that one person might experience as a small trauma could be a big trauma to someone else, depending. Everybody's backgrounds and frames of reference for experiencing life are different, right? And so it's not as simple to be able to bucket things. And so I go with the term more complex trauma.
Mm.
Uh, and there's complex trauma that's acute, as in you go through it. It's a car accident, as you mentioned. And then there's more sort of longer term type of complex trauma, which somebody who grew up in an alcoholic household would experience, right? Because it's not a one event. It's a series of events over time that unfortunately you've learned to normalize, right?
Yeah. Okay. So we're in the same camps. That's good. And even if we weren't, it would still be good.
That's
But
all right.
yeah, I feel the same way. Because when I broke through a fear every day for a year, and when I did that, what I realized at the end
Amazing.
of that, it was. I'll tell you what, it was not traumatic. It was enlightening. It was
I'm sure it
amazing.
was.
It was so good. But at the end of the year, I kind of looked at that, and I look at trauma the same way as I look at fear, and it's just kind of a different thing. But I look at it in the same way and say, like I might say, talking to a stranger is a tremendous fear of mine. I become like my voice stops. I can't speak. I can't say anything to anybody. I can't approach them. Like I might experience this. And that is a form of trauma that I'm experiencing during this
Mhm.
fearful situation. But you may be like, I love meeting new people. Like I walk up to every single stranger and I just start every conversation. And you might think, well, that's a ridiculous fear that you have. Why are you scared of talking to strangers? And the reality is that fear is fear. And it doesn't
Mhm.
matter the level of it, because there is no level. It's fear is fear. And that's how I feel about trauma, is that you can't compare my trauma to your trauma. I had a
I
gentleman do
agree.
this once, and it drove me nuts. There was no way to prove to him that he couldn't compare his situation to mine. And so that's where he was. He was stuck there. That
Yeah.
that his life was worse than mine no matter what. And I wasn't trying to compare. I was just sharing my story. And suddenly
Yeah.
it was a comparison. Like there was no reason for that. And I don't get mad very often, but I got really mad that day.
I can imagine. Yeah, it must have felt pretty invalidating for someone to do that.
Yeah, and that's a great point right there, right? It's like invalidating when we talk about big T, little t. To me, it's invalidating the little whoever determines little t is. Who
Mhm.
are you to determine if my trauma was so small?
Absolutely.
To
Yeah.
me, it could have affected like for me with the running away and coming back home, that affected my life for 46 years.
Yeah.
It might have
I can
started as
imagine.
a little T, but it turned into a huge T. Maybe I don't know. But anyway, it's a
Well,
topic that I get incensed about. So yeah, go on. Please share.
yeah, I think again it comes back to context, because, someone might say, well, why are you afraid of mice? But then they have no idea the story that created that fear,
Yeah.
right? There's no concept or understanding of that. Like a lot of people who perhaps decide to walk in the space of judgment aren't aware of the context behind someone's fear. And so
Yeah.
that's why when we have conversations about trauma, understanding the magnitude of it to a degree is important, because it does influence someone's level of readiness to begin to unpack some of those stories, especially some of the long held ones like yours. And
Yeah.
so what we talk about in counseling is, okay, let's first piece is really just to get to know someone, right? Let's get to know someone. We're here to connect with you as a person and understand that you're multifaceted, multi-layered. There's so many different, what we call biological, psychological, social factors, and also, cultural lenses and sociological lenses that make up who you are, and beyond, right? So that is ultimately the framework, and in some respects, of how somebody might experience traumas. That's really important to understand who someone is, where they're coming from, and all the different elements that shape their reality on a day-to-day basis, because that determines too how you resource somebody. So you might not even start by talking about some of the things that bother people. It might be, hey, I get really, really short of breath and anxious when I go into that situation. So, what we might want to work on to start with is to support the nervous system and the body, and actually creating a greater degree of regulation. So, maybe we start off with something simple, like a few easy things like breath work, which is very powerful, around gear shifting the body down so you get to a point where you can feel safe enough to begin to have a conversation. And then things really do need to unpack in layers and at a pace that is safe for the person, while at the same time pushing just a little bit, within the window of comfort, as we call it, pushing just a little bit so that that person can stretch a little bit beyond where they are, bit by bit, at a pace that's not going to create more trauma.
Exactly. Well, that's an interesting thought there. I never heard of it that way. And yeah, 'cause you as a counselor, you have to really figure that out through conversation, as like, where is that happy medium? That's something you have to figure out, because you could really traumatize, like you mentioned, you don't want to further traumatize them. So you could really traumatize them again, just in a different area, if you're not knowing like where you're going with them, or who they are, or where they've been, right? So there's a lot of, like you mentioned, groundwork that needs to happen at the
That's right.
outset, so you know who you're working with, and what kind of situations. You mentioned the mice. I'm not scared of mice. See, I used to think I was scared of mice. I'm not scared of mice. I just don't want a mouse running across my foot. It's like, so it's interesting, because for me, is like,
Yeah.
as I've started to dive into fears, I really realized that some of these things that I held as fears were not really fears. They were just like, I don't like being touched, or I don't like some things, and it's not because I'm scared of it. I just don't like it, or
Yeah.
like
No,
I
that's
don't want a bunch of ants crawling all over my body. I'm not scared of ants. I just don't like the feeling of them running all over my body. I say that
yeah.
because I had some ants on my body the other day and I freaked out.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that one. I sometimes say, when it comes to spiders, I appreciate them out in nature, but I don't want them on me or in my stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or in
Or
the
in your
bathroom.
pant leg. In your
Oh
pant leg.
no. Let's no.
Yeah, in
Oh.
the bathroom. My grandparents lived in Texas, and they say everything's bigger in Texas, and especially the spiders. And so I remember when I was young, probably about 9 years old, I went to the bathroom, and there were about 6 daddy long legs inside of the toilet, and and that's probably where my beginnings of the spider thing started, was back then. I ran out of there screaming, like you would have thought that there was an axe murderer in that bathroom, but it was just some spiders in the toilet. So anyway,
Yeah. There's
but I
one point
digress.
I wanted to come back to, actually, and when it comes to trauma treatment, and that, again, getting to know somebody is incredibly important, because that's what helps your mental health practitioner determine the best initial approach for you. And sometimes when you're in a trauma or crisis space, you don't have the luxury of seeing somebody for 20 weeks in a row. So there are different modalities out there that can help to process trauma in a shorter amount of sessions as well. And so getting to know the client, getting to know the circumstance, and also understanding, what the time frames are as well, really helps influence the types of interventions that you might leverage in a session with a client. And that's why, for me, like, that concept of co-pilot is so important, because you know better than me, especially in the beginning. While I can certainly notice and observe, you are the wisdom keeper when it comes to your own body and your response systems. So I would have a conversation with you. It's like, when this happens, what comes up? And sometimes part of the healing work is noticing, when situation A happens, what actually happens to me? Do I get short of breath? Okay. Or maybe I get some tension in my body, or there's an imminent thought of I'm not safe that comes up, right? So there could be lots of different ways that people experience being triggered. Yeah. Or maybe there's a trigger that causes people to flee, right? Just as you felt you had to when you were small, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is an interesting topic because when we think about trauma, we might not know that we have it or that we have
Yeah.
experienced it. And so it's really good to talk to somebody like Claire to find out, even just like having do consultation with people to let them know and to figure out if they're a good client for you and vice versa.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
talking to
that's really
someone like
important.
Claire can help you to see, if there's something that you can work through. And what do you think about, there are some people who tell people they need counseling. And then there's other people who are like, I need counseling. So what is, as far as a client coming to you, what are the ideal people to work with? I guess is kind of, I think that's what I'm asking here is like, what are the ideal people to work with? I think I know the answer to this, but I would love to hear, who's that ideal client for you?
I think people are in all stages of awareness when it comes to trauma. So in a number of ways, lots of different kinds of clients are ideal. It's just meeting the client where they're at,
Mm,
and then starting from that place. I think obviously greater progress happens when somebody comes in a space of readiness to tackle a challenge, or recognizes that there is one, and is looking for guidance on how to address it, versus somebody that at that point feels like they don't need any help, they don't see a problem. So I think, and you may arrive at the same conclusion, the person that decides that they need some assistance and seeks it out for themselves is probably in a greater space of readiness than the other individual. And that certainly would influence the level of success that someone would have in a therapeutic setting.
okay. Yeah, totally. Totally. I think that's a great way of putting that so that people know the distinction between the two. And you
Yeah.
can connect with Claire, go to Seascape, and that's spelled CEA, scape solutions at gmail.com. And why is it spelled CEA scape instead of with an S?
It's a play on words, because one of my biggest balance points and my areas of self care is my connection with the ocean. And
Oh,
so, yeah, connection. Oh, the ocean is my form of mindfulness. So, the first four letters of that word also happen to be my initials. And so I thought
oh,
it blended quite nicely with the ocean. And I figured that's a little synchronicity there for fun.
yeah, that's cool. I like that. I like that. And again, it's CEASCAPESOLUTIONS at gmail.com. Connect with Claire over there. Now let's talk a little bit about the book. We have, you're an author in this book, Evolution of Leadership in STEM. The title of
Mhm.
your chapter is Press Pause. You want to tell us a little bit about your chapter without giving it away?
Absolutely. I think the premise of the chapter that I've shared are foundation stones for well-being, and also foundation stones, in my view, of course, for what I think are important for leadership. And press pause is an element that I find is incredibly important. A lot of leaders and a lot of people in general these days are beyond 100 miles an hour, and sometimes the wisdom is what comes through in the quiet spaces. So it's how do we protect that time where we give ourselves that moment to breathe and to pause and to reflect and process all of the things that are coming at us, or to give ourselves permission not to do anything at all and yet to be. There's a lot of focus on being human doings rather than being human beings. And the latter is equally as important.
Yeah, I experience that on a too regular basis. A human doing versus a human being. I have to remind myself, what am I doing? I'm not being,
Yeah, I have to slow myself down too. I've got a 500 mile an hour brain. And so I've come up with a number of different strategies to tap the brakes, and also tap into, to the wisdom of the speed. So meeting myself where I'm at too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Having those tools are always helpful for us to know how to, first of all, having that, you mentioned earlier, awareness, having that awareness that we're going through this. So that was with me. It's like, I just get on that wheel, like you said, 500 miles an hour. And then I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I need to pause, just like you said. But I have to have the awareness before I can even get there. So yeah,
that's right.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Claire, so much for being part of this book. And you can get your copy of the book at actiontakerspublishing.com/STEM. And also there'll be free gifts over there from our authors. Go ahead and cash in on those free gifts. And so I want to thank you all for being here, for tuning in. If you're experiencing trauma or experiencing grief and you want somebody to talk to, please reach out to Claire at Seascape. And that's C with an S. No, C with a C. Seascape with a C, solutions@gmail.com. Go connect with her over there. And Claire, thank you so much for being here, being part of this book, sharing your message, and helping people to break through those traumas so that they can live the life they're truly meant to live. Any final last words from you?
Thanks so much, Lynda, for having me today. It's a privilege to connect with you and everybody who's listening today. Again, a great privilege to be part of the book and be able to share a few kernels of wisdom. I hope they resonate. And yeah, I think a big message again for everybody out there is give yourself permission to slow down and just be a human being, because that in of itself is enough.
Yes, I love that. Slow down, be a human being, because that in of itself is enough. Thanks again so much for being here, Claire. And let's hear a word from one of our authors, Amy Stevens.
You took the overwhelm out of the whole entire process. You said you set the guidelines, you said how many words to have. And it's like, once I sat down and started typing, it just all came out so quickly and so easily. And I loved it. And I had fear to write. And I know about that. I know about that blockage within myself, but it just was so amazing how easy the process was working with Action Takers Publishing.